Well, you can be seated. If you're at home, I imagine you're already seated. Thanks for joining us right here in person or joining us online today. A couple weeks back, I stepped up here to sort of a scrolling intro from Star Wars. Thank you to so many of you that told me that you like that. I appreciate the emails. I hope you actually remembered what I said. But nonetheless, it was a little bit of peek, so to speak, into my childhood about what I liked and what I loved. And so I thought this morning, before we went any farther, I'd kind of give you another peek into my childhood of something that I absolutely loved as a kid. Here it is.
So you wanted to outsmart me, hey? But you can't outsmart the machinery in this factory. And soon you'll be the first two human frosty freezes in history. Wild!
Can this be happening? Batman being made into a pineapple frosty freezy, and Robin into a lime one? Has the diabolical Mr. Freeze outwitted the dynamic duo after all? With some fancy ice work? Hope for a miracle and stay frozen in your seats. Until tomorrow, same time, same channel.
Yes. That was the original Batman series. Now, I'm old, just not old enough to not have watched it in reruns. I caught it in reruns. Maybe you caught it in the original, but it's the good stuff. It's with Adam West and all the hokiness. How many of you here have seen or watched that before? Let me see your hands. If you're online, maybe just let the other people know. Yeah, I loved it. So you probably know this already, but just serving as a reminder that whenever the Batman show would come on, it always came in two parts. Episode 1, and then episode 2 would be the resolution of what happened at the cliffhanger moment at the end of episode 1. You remember that, right? What would happen is at the end of episode 1, Batman and Robin would always find themselves in a situation where they thought, no one is ever going to get out of this. And so what they do is they'd have this cliffhanger moment, and then they would tell you to stay tuned, right? And they started this way, but eventually they would say, tune in tomorrow, same what? Bat time, right? Same bat channels. You already know this, right? Sometimes, by the way, I wish I remembered scripture, like I remembered some of that sort of stuff. Some of you know what I'm talking about? But yeah. And here's the thing, no matter how unexpected the situation they found themselves in, and it was, or how desperate it was, at the end of episode 1, here's what I knew. I knew that come episode 2, Batman and Robin would escape, and they would win, right? You knew that. Even as a kid, I knew this, how to know it. There are these two reasons. Number one, they named the show Batman. So you can't kill off the main guy, right, and expect it to go well. So I knew he was going to win. But also, here's the other thing. He was Batman. And Batman always won. This week, we find ourselves at the end of, instead of a 2-part series, sort of a 4-part series called Life Unexpected, looking at the book of Ruth. And instead of it being 4 episodes, there are 4 chapters in the book of Ruth. And each one of these chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 that we've already been through, sort of end with what I would like to say a cliffhanger moment. And today, as we get to chapter 4, we're going to get to see the end. And if we allow it, if we really understand what's going on here in chapter 4, and then we take chapter 4 and apply it to all that we've seen. And so if you've not been with us in this series, that's okay. We're going to talk about some things that apply to the whole book today. So I encourage you to go back maybe and listen to it later online, or just go and read the Bible yourselves. Chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. It'll catch you up. But one of the powers of this story is that it models for us. It models for us how to live in light of God's providence, even when we're waiting. It models for us how we can live and how we can trust God even in those sort of cliffhanger moments. It shows us the truth about who God is and who we are. And as I was working on this series and I began to make my way to chapter 4, I had this sort of profound thought. Hopefully this will make sense when it comes out of my mouth, but it's not going to sound really profound because I'm going to reference Batman, but hopefully it's something you can relate to. And here's my desire. My hope and my desire at some point is this, is I want to live towards God the way I felt about Batman. See what I mean by that? I mean, I know every time that I could have trust that what would happen, even when it said to be continued, that the hero of the story would still win. In the same way, I want to live in my own life. I want us all to live in our life to be so transformed, because that's God's goal, right? God sent us Jesus, his son, in order to transform us in such a way that we can be put back in relationship with God, but also not to just put us back into relationship with God, but to also help make us to be people that look more like his son Jesus. That's a goal of transformation. I want to be so transformed in my life. I want us all to be so transformed that whenever those moments happen, I can live with confidence that God is still going to show up and be the hero of my story because of what I know about God. How about you? I think it's one of those things that are a lot easier to say than to live from, right? I know in my life, there have been many times where the villain shows up, whether it's, a financial villain or a relational villain or just a villain. Into my story, and things begin to be unexpected, I haven't always looked towards God and have the trust in him and the providence that he had that I should. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone. But Ruth, if we really understand what God's trying to do here, can help us. Ruth will show us how we can have trust in the providence of the hero of our story. And he is a hero not made up. He's a hero immeasurably more than we could have asked for or imagined. The hero of our story, the hero of every single person's story, if they allow them to be, guess who it is? His name's Jesus. He's the hero that this points to. When life is unexpected, we can expect Jesus to win on our behalf. And so as we close this series, I don't want to miss some things that Ruth is telling us. Remember, at the end of chapter 1. The end of chapter 1, Naomi, the mother-in-law of Ruth, and Ruth go back to Bethlehem, where Naomi was originally from. She had left 10 years before Naomi with a husband and 2 sons, and she came back with a widow, and she lost both her sons and one daughter-in-law. The other one stayed. And because they were widows, at the end of chapter 1, you didn't know how they were going to survive. Chapter 2 introduces us to a redeemer. His name is Boaz. And he, by the way, is an archetype of Jesus all throughout this story of the book of Ruth. And as we see chapter 2 show up, we see in God's providence, Ruth find her way to Boaz's field, and this relationship sort of begins, and where she knows that she can go back over the next 3 or 4 months and be provided for with grain, or be provided for with wheat, as she could glean in his field. But even as chapter 2 ended, you knew that there was this tension that they only had provision for 3 or 4 months, and you weren't exactly sure what was going to happen between eligible bachelorette Ruth and eligible bachelor Boaz. So when we get to chapter 3, we see this plan is developed. We talked about it last week by Naomi, that Ruth says, I'll go ahead and do it. And Ruth goes forward and she presents herself to Boaz, and basically she says, Boaz, I want you to stop putting duct tape. Thank you for the gratitude. Thank you for what you've done. But you have the ability as my kinsman redeemer to not only just fix my problem day to day, but to permanently resolve my problem and Naomi's problem. And the way that you could do that is if you choose to marry me. She proposes to him. And as we end chapter 3, if you're with us last week or if you read chapter 3 on your own, you know that Boaz says, yes, I'm willing to do this, but there's something else I have to do first before I can marry you. So as we pick up chapter 4 this morning, we're going to see Boaz doing exactly what he promised he would do at the end of chapter 3. He's going to see a man about a girl. So if you have your Bibles, go right there to Ruth chapter 4, open them up. If you've got it with us, dial in your digital device, whether at home or here, or just follow along on the screen. But this is what it says in Ruth chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, I want to stop there because at first it could just seem like it was a happy accident. But this is another one of those moments where it's a Godcidence. God is working out in his timing that the person that Boaz is looking for, another redeemer, is going to be there right when he needs to be. And behold, the redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And the redeemer turned aside and he sat down. And so Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. And then Boaz says to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." Verse 4. "So I thought I would tell it to you and say, well, because you're a redeemer, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you." Said another way, you're first in line, and I come after you, and I'm giving you this opportunity. And what happens is this other redeemer says, well, I will redeem it. So Boaz arrives at the gate, and the man just by coincidence shows up at the gate, and Boaz says, "Hey, come alongside, sit down. I want to present to you a business opportunity." Now, some of you have had people invite you to the house and say they want to present you with a business opportunity, right? And you say, what's the catch? Well, in this moment, he's presenting to this unnamed redeemer, Boaz is, an opportunity that only he and only he at that moment was qualified to consider. Now, up to this point, when we've been talking about a kinsman redeemer, if you've been in this series or if you read chapter 1 to chapter 3, we've been talking about it specifically through this idea. And we know it's strange to us in our culture and our way, but if someone, a man and a woman, got married and the man happened to die and they did not have a child yet, the way it worked in Old Testament times, both in Israel and in the Jewish nation, and also, by the way, in all the other cultures, was then they would offer them the brother. And the brother would then, the goal would be to have a child, specifically a male child, to perpetuate the line, the inheritance through the male child. And if that didn't work, that brother, then it'd go to another brother. There was a line. That's how the redeemers worked. And I know it's unbelievably strange to us, but that's how it worked. But there has been an aspect that we haven't touched on yet when it comes to redemption. It wasn't just about a person. It was also about the property. Some of you have, sort of family passed down property. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe you got something on the lake. Others of us don't maybe have that, but we have friends who do, so we want to stay friends with them so you can go be at the family passed down property, the lake. You know what I'm saying, right? Right? It just kind of stays in the family. You don't want to ever get it out of the family or that sort of stuff. Well, in that culture, it was very important that your land stayed with your family. And then the only time that you would ever sell your land is if you absolutely positively had no other way to survive. You see, now Naomi and now Ruth are at the end of barley season and wheat season, and they'd been given food every day, but now they're going to run out of an opportunity to glean every day, and they were going to need financial resources in order to buy food going into the next season, and they didn't have it. So it came down to this moment that all Naomi had left was the property that fit in her family name coming from the line of her husband Elimelech. That should have gone to both of her sons, who was going to provide it, but both her sons were now dead. And so now she's in this dire straight moment. And so when you had to sell your property, the first person that had the opportunity to buy the property would be a kinsman redeemer. That's why he's going here. But notice I said the first person who has the first opportunity. This means that others might have an opportunity as well. And one of the unique things that the book of Ruth sort of lets us in on, help us know some background, is that ability to redeem something did not mean obligation to redeem something. Don't miss that. Just because you could redeem a scenario didn't mean you were obliged and had to redeem the scenario. Why? Because with every redemption process, there's a cost. And in every redemption process, there's a cost. And there was one here. Not just the property, but what Boaz wants to let this man know is if you buy the property, you need to know the fine print. What also comes with the property. Take a look at verse 5. Then Boaz said, after the guy said he'll redeem it, "The day you buy the field, let me let you in on something. The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead." Now I want to pause here because, again, this is culturally removed from our time, and it seems like we're presenting women as property. I want to say back then and now, women are not property. They are made in the image of God, and they're due respect and love and honor. And don't read anything from this section of Scripture that says otherwise. It's a sermon for a different time, but I couldn't let that go. So you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead. Why? Well, because as the kinsman redeemer who buys his property, you still have to perpetuate the name of the dead in the inheritance. You still have to give an heir through Elimelech or through the sons that passed away. So, and it says in verse 6, as the Redeemer sees this and understands this, the Redeemer said, well, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. You see, Boaz didn't want this man who's unnamed to miss the fine print. Have you ever gone to your iTunes store or whatever it may be to buy something, this whole terms and conditions we just click on and don't read? Probably every single one of us in this room could be owned by Apples, and we don't know, right? Because we just click through those terms of service, all the other obligations, all the fine print. And I'm convinced those companies make it very difficult to understand. So we're having to do something or be a particular way. Boaz didn't want Elimelech to miss this. He wanted him to know, look, here's the fine print. When you redeem and you set this land free by paying a price, it also means that you take responsibility for Ruth. And by implicit nature of this, when you take responsibility for Ruth, you also take responsibility for Naomi as a widow. And when he thought about that deeper, what at first seemed like a good idea doesn't seem like a good idea anymore. You ever thought at first something was a good idea? Yeah. Maybe you thought that thing that you bought on the internet that looked a particular way, and then it shows up. So you know what I'm talking about? It doesn't look anything like what you thought it was. It's not a real good idea. And he said, well, now that this man begins to understand all that's involved in redeeming, he says, look, this isn't going to work for me. We're not exactly sure the reason, but upon hearing this, the first Redeemer reveals he cannot or will not pay the price because of the personal risk it took for him. The risk was too great. And so since he wouldn't do it, what he says is, I will pass my ability to redeem now to the next person in line, which happened to be Boaz. So what sort of happens over the next several verses is that this gets recorded, so to speak, as a transaction. Now, for you and I, if we sign a contract or maybe we buy a home or a condo or those sort of things, you know that many times what occurs is, right, someone has to notarize it, and then you take it to the courthouse. And you record it there, and they keep a record of this official transaction to let everyone know what has happened, and it could be attested to later on if there's a question. That's not how it happened back then. What they would do is they would sit at the city gate, just like Boaz was doing. And they bring the elders around, and they bring some witnesses around. And what they would do is they would attest to what had happened. They would say, yes, we are witnesses that this unnamed Redeemer has now passed the right of redemption over to Boaz. And it kind of works that way as the courthouse. And to make it even just one step further, to seal the contractual agreement, the person who was ceding his right as kinsman redeemer, this unnamed person, took off their sandal, and then they gave it to the person. So that if anyone later on came back and said, it didn't happen the way you said it was happening, it's like, well, then why do I have his sandal? It was proof of contract. So the sandals pass, the witness testify, and they reach agreement. And what comes next as we get to verse 13 is the part that we've been waiting for, at least I've been waiting for, as we move all the way to Ruth chapter 4. It's a permanent solution. It's this sort of resolving of this continual cliffhanger moment that's happened in Naomi's life and in Ruth's life. There's no more duct tape on the situation. All the counterintuitive things that Ruth had done, where she leaned back when instead many people would lean forward, we now see that it didn't make sense logically at the time, but what's going to become into clear view is that God had a purpose and a plan about who he was and what he was going to do for Ruth and for Naomi, whether they knew it or understood it or not. So that when we get to verse 13, this is what we read. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception. I want to stop here. The timeline is unclear about how long Ruth had been married to her husband that passed away, but it is clear that they were not able to have children. And what it seems to be highly implied here is that God is now doing a miracle in this moment that didn't happen before. And that is providing for her an ability to have a child. Specifically, it says at the end of verse 13, and she bore a son. Verse 14, Then the women said to Naomi, now these are the same women back in chapter 1, if you remember them. Remember when Naomi showed up, the women were kind of talking in the town about her showing up. The women say now to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. Remember, chapter 1, when she shows up back in Bethlehem after her husband died and both the kids, the women come around and they call her Naomi, which means pleasant. And she's like, don't call me pleasant, call me Mara, which means bitter. And now when we get to chapter 4, what these same women are reminding them is you now have gone from pleasant to bitter to blessed. God in his providence has come in and he's begun to bless you. He's begun to do these things. Verse 15 says this, he, this boy, shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Got to stop here too, because this doesn't make a lot of sense to us. What does he mean he's more to you than 7 sons? Now, again, during those times, we know that what they would look for is for a boy to be born to pass on the family line. But also in the ancient times, especially in the Old Testament, in Jewish ways of thinking, the number 7 was the number of completion or perfection. And so there's a metaphor going on here. When she is saying 7 sons, in that day, if someone had 7 sons, they would consider that to be the perfect family. Now, if you're in here and you have 7 sons, I know you can say that is not a perfect family, right? There's challenges there. That's a metaphor. But catch this. They're saying, listen, the person that God gave you, your daughter-in-law Ruth, she's beyond perfection. She is more than what you could have asked for or we could have even imagined when God gave you her. Verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who just wound up happening to be then the father of David, who would be the second king of Israel. It's so interesting, right? Chapter 1, right? The book of Ruth opens with like 3 funerals, and it ends with a wedding and a baby shower. Kind of changes a bit, right? It opens with despair and difficulty, but it ends with hope and a promise. It opens with weeping, but it ends with rejoicing. It opens with doubt, but then it ends in many ways in perfection. And so much of this book, by the way, especially when Boaz comes into the scene in chapter 2, is this idea. We've talked about this literary idea of foreshadowing. It's this telling us of what is about to happen and what is going to happen for Naomi and Ruth, but it's not just about foreshadowing what's going to happen for Naomi and Ruth, but it's also foreshadowing what can happen to everyone of all time. You see, the willingness of Boaz to take on the cost of redemption foreshadows someone who would eventually come from the family line of Ruth and Boaz, who then had a grandson named David, who eventually had someone come from his line who's known as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. The one who's the hero, not just of this story, but every story, if we so choose to let it happen. The one who is more than we can ask or imagine, and you know who it is, right? His name? Jesus. When we look at the book of Ruth, and we look at Scripture, right, we keep saying this, reminding to ourselves that the Bible is here for a purpose. Listen, Ruth is a historical book, but it's not here just for a history lesson. And I love history. I really do. I'm just not contractually required to say that because my wife's a history teacher. I love history. But the Bible is not just about having us know a history lesson, but it's about being living and active and teaching us today what we need to know. Truths about God, truths about ourselves, and truths about the world that we live in. And this is what the book of Ruth does for us when we understand it as a whole. It gives us truths that we need if we are to be the people God wants to be, if we are able to survive, so to speak, in the unexpected, if we're to look towards God the way we want to look towards God in the midst of every moment. And so there's some things I don't want us to miss. And some of this stuff may be embedded from the first 3 chapters. And again, if you have not read the first 3 chapters or listened to the first 3 sermons, I deeply encourage you to go back this week and do it. It's right there in the Bible. Won't take long. But here's some things. This is the first. Jesus is the only Redeemer with sufficient standing. See, one of the ways the story of Ruth sort of breaks down in the metaphor is this, is that Boaz was not the only Redeemer with sufficient standing. There was actually someone in front of him that could have done the job. But when it comes to our situation and our need and what we need to be redeemed from, I want to be clear, no one and nothing else can do what Jesus is designed to do. I want to read some verses. John chapter 1, verse 3. Through him, Jesus, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. That is power. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. That is power. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He, Jesus, is before all things, and in him, Jesus, all things hold together. That is power. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, the Son, Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And after Jesus had provided purification for our sins, a payment, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. That is power. When it comes to the power to redeem us, needed to restore us back in relationship with God, there is no one else that is a sufficient redeemer. I'm not saying that there aren't other things or other people that will try to pretend to be sufficient redeemers. They're just not. That job that you love, it can't redeem you. That person that you're married to, no matter how great they might be or challenging they might be, they can't redeem you. What's in your bank account, what's in your neighborhood, the car that you drive, the way people think of you or don't think of you, they cannot redeem you. They all go away. Jesus is the only sufficient redeemer. He's the only one that has the power to put us back in relationship. There's no one else that can do it. But one of the things that Ruth has taught us is that power is one thing. Willingness is a completely different thing. Here's the second thing. Jesus didn't let the fine print deter him. I'm going to take a little bit of a turn here, but I couldn't help but think this week about so many of our veterans. Here's why. Because they willfully signed up, knowing that the result of that could be they would put their life in harm's way, and they didn't let that truth about what could happen in the future in the fine print deter them. Thank you. You were willing to risk your safety for everyone else's freedom. And by the way, Jesus, he risked everything for our freedom. And he had no obligation. He didn't have to do it. No one was twisting his arm. No one saying, Jesus, you had to do this. In fact, Jesus himself makes it clear in John chapter 10, verse 17 and 18. Jesus says this, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. Verse 18, no one takes it from me. No one. But I lay it down on my own accord. I'm a willing redeemer. You see, it's one thing to have power, but power without willingness is completely and utterly irrelevant to our situation. He had both. And he did it knowing all of these things. None of the fine print caught Jesus off guard. Did we grasp that? How much he knowingly took upon himself. It's like, I'm going to leave heaven. And I'm going to take on the form of my creation. I'm going to be born from a woman. I'm going to be completely vulnerable. The God of the universe who created everyone spoke and said, I'm going to put myself in that vulnerability. And then I'm going to live 30 some odd years on this earth. And I don't care how nice the suburb is that you live in. It's not like heaven. I'm going to do 30 some odd years here. Then I'm knowingly going to go to one of the most gruesome ways ever created to die. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be mocked and spit on. And I'm going to be hung on a cross by nails and go through all that physical torture. But not just the physical torture. Those people who I've invested in and I know in, the people that I've loved for years, they're going to turn their backs on me and run away. And they're going to be people thousands of years later who hear about this story and say, yes, I get the story, but they're still going to kind of look at judges and live that way, like we've said that happened all throughout Ruth. They'll recognize what I've done, but still do what they want to do. Do you understand that? I can't grasp it. I can say it out of my mouth, but I can't grasp it in my head. Knowing all of that, he stepped into it. So he could redeem the empty way of life and give us back the one that could be lived in the full. Jesus had the power and the willingness to pay the price that we could not pay. But I think there's something else. There's this temptation, I believe, that we have to think of Jesus as sort of a one-time redeemer. Here's what I mean by that. That we accept the truth of the gospel and the story of the gospel, that we have to accept what Jesus did on the cross and rose victorious over sin, death, and the grave to redeem us, to put us back in a relationship with God. However, after that happens, many times we live in such a way that gives off this line of thinking, that he redeemed us once, but when we mess up after we become believers, it's on our own to fix it. Do you know what Ruth teaches us? That Jesus is a ceaseless redeemer. Ruth reveals the providence of God in many ways. But one is this, is that he continually redeemed their situation, even when from an earthly perspective, the situation seemed unable to be redeemed. Listen, at the end of chapter 1, there was not a lot of hope. Jesus was working, even, by the way, when from an earthly perspective, don't miss this, Naomi, she found herself in problems that she caused herself. Yet, he did not stop redeeming her. He used his providence for her. And I love this term. Some theologians have sort of described providence this way: as God's continual creation in our life, as opposed to this sort of idea, right? That God just sort of wound up the world like a clock, started it, and then doesn't get involved in it anymore. But rather, God in his providence and his continual creation, this is what he does. He's continually creating life when our decisions would have brought death. Did we miss that? He is continually creating life when our decisions would have brought death. When those sort of black lines, when we look back on our life, look really ugly and that sort of stuff, he can do something 1 billion times more powerful than this guy. He's coming, I think. There he is. You guys know who that is, right? Bob Ross. By the way, veteran. A lot of people don't think about him that way. I used to watch Bob Ross growing up, which really says a lot about my childhood. Batman and Bob Ross. I'm not really sure why, but there was something amazing about what he would do. He'd paint a painting in 30 minutes, right? He'd do it on TV, and there would like this line like would happen and that sort of stuff. And it seemed like he completely and utterly messed up the painting. You know what I'm talking about? And they'd be like, oh, no. There are no mistakes. Just happy what? Just happy accidents. And then like he'd do something with a brush. He'd take like the titanium blue or whatever he would do, and he'd do all this, and next thing you're like, bam. There was this amazing, beautiful picture that at the one time you'd have thought, that's just going to be ugly. He was providentially creating and whatever happened. And here's what I want you to know this. There is no one more creative than God. There is no one more creative than God. Jesus doesn't stop redeeming our messes. His willingness to redeem us doesn't dry up. Now, I'm not saying that in the midst of the moment that you might find yourself right now or later on, that it doesn't seem like it can't be redeemed. But I'm telling you, there's nothing you've ever painted on the canvas of your life that he can't take and make beautiful if we let him. So Ruth is teaching us, and that's what brings us to the fourth thing. Not only is Jesus a ceaseless redeemer, but he's also this. Jesus is a purposeful redeemer. God always has a purpose. Now, I'm not saying God's purpose and my purpose match up. Have you ever found that moment in your life? There's sometimes I kind of begin to see Jesus play something out in my life, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure I like that. And he's like, okay, it doesn't matter. I'm God, trust me. That's where the tension comes sometimes. But Romans chapter 8 tells us this, that God in his providence is always about trying to conform us to make us more like Jesus. His main goal is to make us more like God. And again, in those times, in those moments, it's often uncomfortable, and it's often painful, and it's often difficult. But what he tells us is this, is he doesn't waste our pain, our mistakes that we've made or that the world's poor decisions made against us. But rather in his providence, he's constantly in creative mode, bringing new life where our decisions or some other person's decisions would have brought death. He is able to do immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine. He didn't just do immeasurably more, he is doing immeasurably more. What does it mean? It means that we can trust in the providence of Jesus as the hero of our story, that when life is unexpected, we can expect Jesus to win on our behalf. And so I got to reflect on my own life. I mean, are there times where I feel like the God of the universe, Jesus, like, the hero of my story, has been outwitted by the enemy? Like, it's at the end of episode 1, and I actually think that episode 2 is, there's not going to be a resolution if I let God resolve it. Listen, we've all had situations, moments where we've made our own mistakes or have cliffhanger moments. Maybe we don't say it in that moment, but where is our trust level? Do we actually wind up had more trust towards the old television show that Batman would get it figured out in episode 2 than we do that God would get it figured out in our episode 2? I do. What Ruth here shows us the truth about who God is and what we know about him. And I want for us, I want for all of us, myself, my family, for you, for Loudoun County, to be able to live life towards Jesus and believe towards him the way I believed about Batman. I know that sounds crazy, but what we know about God is more powerful. What we know about his character is greater. And no matter what happens in the to be continued episode, what we know is this. I said he's providentially working if we trust him. How are we living? I know it's a whole lot easier to say I trust than to live I trust. It's a whole lot easier for you to say you trust than to live you trust. That's it. But Ruth teaches us that we can trust him. And he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so, God, we're grateful for that. And we're thankful. And may we now respond in the way that you would have us respond to these truths. Amen. So in these next few moments, you can choose to stand, or you can choose to stay seated, whatever is best for you. But I want you to have a conversation with God, whether you have that by singing along or whether you have that just by talking to him and praying right there. And in those moments, allow him to speak in your life of where he wants to expand your trust.